So, good morning, everybody. Welcome to PLC II. It's 8 o'clock on April 24th. I'm trying to keep track of how many days that it's been since we've actually seen each other. And we have to go back before spring break. So we're talking like probably, 5 or 6 weeks now since we've seen each other face to face. So it is nice to see your faces this morning. I appreciate that. And thank you for getting up early and being here. Um, I tend to see just the faces of my family, so it is kind of nice to see other faces too. Not that I don't love my family, but it's nice to see your faces too. So today, let me share my screen with you, and we'll show you the agenda for today's stuff. The welcoming time that we're doing here, and then what we'll get to after this. My suspicion is that at this point in time in your curriculum and instruction classes, you've been introduced to the lesson plan assignment. And so I'll do a quick little thing that helps us try to connect the cube to actually writing out those lesson plans. If this was a perfect world, we could be face-to-face with each other, and this is what we would have been doing, from week to week. But since you now have that, and that's been in front of you, we'll try to tackle it today. We'll do some about 10 minutes of small group discussions today about what you saw for emotional and intellectual safety and choice. Maybe some personal examples from your own educational career. And then we're going to introduce, before the small groups this time, we're going to introduce the next topic, which is novelty and variety and authenticity, and kind of go through that. And if you have any personal educational experiences with that, you can kind of talk through those in your small groups too. Hot topics, they weren't working in our format, so we cut those out. We're done with the hot topics. It wasn't, this format is not conducive to discussing hot topics. So we cut those out. We'll just do the things we need to do to get done. We'll come back. We'll talk a little bit about what you guys said in your small groups, and then we'll talk a little bit about what is coming next week, and then we'll be out. So that's the general plan for today. As I kind of get into things here just a little bit. Let's do this. Let me share my screen with you again. Then sorry, I meant to have this pulled up already. Okay, so we've been talking about Antonetti's cube, and Antonetti's cube is essentially the work of three other researchers that he's kind of combined together. The top part of the cube, remember, is the Marzano high-yield instructional strategies. The right side of the cube is this big idea thinking that comes from Bloom's taxonomy. And the front part of this stuff is the things that you've been looking for in your observations. This is the work of Philip Schlechte, the 8 engaging qualities of instruction. And so essentially what we want you to take from this cube is that if you bring it out in terms of your lesson planning, if you kind of look at it and pick maybe one thing from each side of the cube and try to build that into your lesson plan, then what you'll have is a quality, engaging lesson plan for your students. So let me kind of show you an example of what we're talking about. There it is. This is the modified Hunter parallel instruction lesson plan. Some of you may choose to do the 5E plan, or there are other templates that you might follow, but this, in general, this has the same stuff as the other plans. It may be in a little bit of a different format, but when I did lesson plans, this was generally the format that I stuck to. So let me just talk about how you would use the cube in formatting your lesson plan. And so one of the first things that you do in terms of the cube, in terms of the lesson plan, is this thing called the anticipatory step. That's what Hunter calls it. On the 5E plan, I think it's called engagement. How is it that you bring your students into the framework of the class? Well, if we use the cube, one thing I was a social studies teacher, so one thing that I would want my students to do, if we pretend our unit is a transition between the 1920s and the 1930s, as they come in, what I will do is read 2 selections, just small pieces of reading, one from the 1920s and one from the 1930s. Then I would have shoulder partners discuss the differences between the 20s and 30s that they heard in those selections. That's how we'd enter into the time of lesson for transition between the 1920s and 1930s in my classroom. So if we go back to the cube, then essentially what you can see that what I've done is I want them to talk to me about similarities and differences between the 1920s and 1930s in that opening part. And so I've taken that as a high yield instructional strategy from the top part of the cube. I've said that I want them to talk about it with each other. And so there's this idea of learning with others that comes from the engaging qualities of work from the front of the cube. And I want them to analyze, because I want them to kind of compare those similarities or differences. Okay, so I've taken one thing from each side of the cube as I've designed that anticipatory set for my lesson. That's one way that you can use the cube. The second thing in the lesson that I've done is we get into this idea of some people call it independent practice, or the you do portion of the assignment or the lesson. I've said that in groups of 4, I want each person to draw a popsicle stick out of a, I don't know, like a can or a bottle or something. And those 4 popsicle sticks, there's 4 people in the group. One of the popsicle sticks has the good things about the 1920s, the bad things about the 1920s is the next popsicle stick, good things about the 1930s, bad things about the 1930s. If they don't like their popsicle stick, they can trade it with somebody else if they can work out the trade. Then what they'll get is 5 minutes to read through texts and any notes that I've given. They'll have a period to bounce ideas off their partners or their teacher. They're going to take their popsicle stick and present their findings to another group. That's part of the independent practice. And so if, again, we look at the cube, you can see that part of what I want them to do is summarizing and note-taking, because they're going to have to go through and look at what they've been given as far as notes, have to read back through their text, talk with each other. Again, we've got this learning of others, and then there's this thing of a sense of audience, because they're going to present their findings to another group. They've got some choice in how they conduct their research. They've got choice because they can trade back and forth if they want to. There's a little bit of novelty and variety in the assignment, because I don't bring out popsicle sticks every day. And again, on this big idea of thinking, there's synthesis and analysis that is going on. So I've taken at least one thing and sometimes more things from each side of those cubes. And you can kind of see that. So that's the general idea of how you use the cube when you create your lesson plans. And one of the reasons that we want you to be familiar with that is so that when you design those lesson plans, you can pick and choose from each of those sides and create something that is engaging for students, and also engages them in like high order thinking skills. And the more often they do things like that, the more likely they are to retain the information that you want them to retain. So that's one of the reasons that we do that for you. Okay. Share my screen again with you. I'm going to do qualities of engagement. And as I put you into your small groups, remember this time, actually, hang on, sorry guys. Get to my agenda. Okay, so as we go back into small groups, there's some things that we want you to discuss. The videos that you watched this past week, you're going to talk about emotional and intellectual safety and choice. And then we're also going to have you do some personal experience with novelty and variety and authenticity, kind of set the stage for what you're going to look for in your videos this week. So let me talk quickly about novelty and variety and authenticity. In general, novelty and variety is something that I don't know, routine is really important in the framework of education, but sometimes routine can be routine, very dull, very boring. It's nice to inject certain things in there that enhance learning experiences that maybe you don't do every day in your classroom. That's kind of the definition of novelty and variety. And so every now and again, throw a game in there. Kahoot is a big deal for middle school kids. I remember in particular high school kids too, even college kids like Kahoots. Simulations or role plays, competitions. If you can make anything a competition in your classroom, that's a pretty big deal in your lesson planning as well. A variety of products, give them choice in what they do. The idea of games, like we said, and competitions, responding in the voice of somebody else. So answering a question in the person of somebody else, those are all novelty and variety. And what's the other one that we're looking for? Authenticity, that's what I thought. So the idea of relevance is very important. I remember my high school math classes, and I pretty much asked the same question every day, which was, how am I ever going to use this, Mrs. Astor, in my real life? And sometimes she could answer me, and sometimes she couldn't. And if it would have been more relevant to me, maybe I would have done better in math. Maybe not, though, because math was never my thing. Can you connect it to a real life activity? That's why we've talked a lot about project-based learning and some of the other classes that you've been doing, hands-on and manipulative stuff. Make it an extension of a workplace activity, or connect it in some way to technology, either in school or in home. Those are ways to make things more engaging through that quality of authenticity. So I'm going to throw you into small groups here. Questions you kind of talk about are on this agenda. The agenda you find in the online week 5 module. There it is, the agenda for April 24th. Small groups probably have 3 or 4 people in them. Kind of speak to those questions. I'll probably give you about 8 to 10 minutes in the small groups. I'm going to stop recording here. So as we come back from our small groups, was there anything in the groups that was way out as far as not agreeing on what some of those selected qualities were? Did you all essentially, were you able to identify and see that you identify similar qualities for the observations that you did? Okay. Any questions about authenticity, or what was the other one? Shoot, I can never remember that other one. Authenticity, or let me look it up. Novelty and variety. Any questions about that for what you're looking for next week? Okay, so do that one for next week. We'll be back here one more time. We'll kind of talk about that. There'll be what you'll do when you come back next week. We have this like an end of semester assessment on your PLCing skills, how you get together and communicate with people. So that'll be what we do next week. I'll introduce that to you, and we'll probably finish that offline, quite honestly. So we'll see you back here one more time next week. And until then, have a great day, a great weekend. Be safe, be smart, all those sorts of things. And we'll see you later. Take care, guys.
See you.
Bye-bye.